The GPS signal flickered as Sarah Matthews gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white against the worn leather. The narrow mountain road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, flanked by towering pine trees that cast long shadows across their rental car. Beside her, her husband Michael squinted at his phone screen, trying to make sense of the spotty cell service that had been cutting in and out for the past hour. "Are you sure this is the right way, honey?" Sarah's voice carried a tremor of uncertainty that she tried to mask with a forced smile. After 32 years of marriage, she knew Michael could read her emotions like an open book, but she didn't want him to see how unsettled she felt about this trip. Michael adjusted his reading glasses and tapped the screen again. "According to the directions Rebecca sent us, we should be getting close. She said the house is just past the old wooden bridge, about 2 miles into Cedar Hollow." His voice held that familiar tone of gentle reassurance that had comforted Sarah through decades of life's uncertainties. Their children's first days of school, job changes, her mother's long illness, and now this unexpected adventure they'd embarked upon. The idea for this weekend getaway had seemed so romantic when their daughter Rebecca first suggested it. Fresh out of college and working for a travel blog, Rebecca had discovered this remote Airbnb listing while researching off-the-beaten-path destinations in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. The property description painted a picture of rustic charm, a beautifully restored 1920s cabin nestled in the heart of Pisgah National Forest, complete with a wraparound porch, stone fireplace, and views that stretched for miles across the mountain valleys. "Mom, Dad, you two never take real vacations anymore," Rebecca had insisted during their weekly Sunday dinner. "You've been talking about wanting to reconnect and spend quality time together since you both retired. This place looks absolutely perfect. No distractions, no schedules, just you two and nature." Sarah had been hesitant at first. At 68, she preferred the comfort of familiar hotels with reliable Wi-Fi, room service, and housekeeping. The thought of staying in some remote cabin where the nearest neighbor might be miles away made her stomach flutter with anxiety. But Michael, ever the adventurer even at 71, had been immediately enchanted by the idea. "Come on, sweetheart," he'd said, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she stood at their kitchen sink, watching the sunset through their suburban window. "When's the last time we did something spontaneous, something just for us? The kids are grown, the house is paid off, and we've got nothing but time. Let's make some new memories." The way he said it, with that boyish enthusiasm that had first attracted her to him in college, melted her resistance. They'd been through so much together, raising 3 children, building careers, caring for aging parents, and now navigating the sometimes lonely landscape of retirement. Maybe a weekend away really was exactly what they needed. But as they'd researched the location more thoroughly, Sarah had stumbled across some unsettling information. Online forums and travel review sites were filled with conflicting accounts about the area. Some visitors raved about the peaceful solitude and stunning natural beauty. Others, however, shared stories that made Sarah's skin crawl. Tales of unexplained sounds in the night, objects that seemed to move on their own, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Several reviews mentioned an uncomfortable feeling that made guests leave earlier than planned. "It's probably just people with overactive imaginations," Michael had said when Sarah showed him the concerning reviews. "You know how these things get blown out of proportion on the internet. Plus, look at all the positive reviews. There are way more of those than negative ones." He was right, of course. The property had an overall rating of 4.2 stars, and many guests praised the host's responsiveness and the cabin's authentic mountain character. But something about those negative reviews nagged at Sarah. They had a quality of genuine fear that seemed difficult to fake. As they wound deeper into the mountains, the October afternoon light was beginning to fade. Sarah noticed how the trees seemed to press closer to the road with each passing mile, their branches creating an almost tunnel-like canopy overhead. The air had grown cooler, and she reached over to turn up the car's heat. "Look, there's the bridge," Michael pointed ahead, to where an old wooden structure spanned a narrow creek. The bridge looked like something from another era, with weathered planks and rustic handrails that spoke of decades of mountain storms and seasonal flooding. They crossed slowly, the car's tires humming against the worn wood. Below them, Sarah could see dark water moving swiftly over moss-covered rocks. The sound of rushing water filled the brief silence as they passed over, and for a moment, she felt a strange chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. 2 more miles, Michael announced, consulting his phone again. Rebecca said we can't miss it. Apparently there's a hand-carved wooden sign that says, Whispering Pines Retreat. The name itself had been part of what drew them to the property. In their online research, they'd learned that the cabin had been built in 1923 by a wealthy businessman from Charlotte who'd wanted a peaceful escape from city life. The property had changed hands several times over the decades, eventually being converted into a vacation rental about 5 years ago by a couple from Asheville who specialized in restoring historic mountain properties. As they drove deeper into Cedar Hollow, Sarah noticed how few houses they passed. The occasional mailbox or driveway marker suggested hidden homes tucked back in the trees, but the sense of isolation was palpable. Cell service had become practically non-existent, and even the radio had faded to static. There it is, Michael said suddenly, slowing the car as they approached a narrow gravel driveway marked by the promised wooden sign. The carved letters were deep and expertly crafted, though Sarah noticed they were weathered in a way that suggested they'd been there longer than 5 years. The driveway curved upward through a grove of ancient pine trees, their trunks so massive that Sarah imagined they'd been saplings when the cabin was first built. Shafts of golden late-afternoon sunlight filtered through the branches, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the gravel path. When the cabin finally came into view, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was even more beautiful than the photos had suggested. The 2-story structure was built from massive logs that had aged to a rich honey color, and the promised wraparound porch extended across the entire front of the house, furnished with rocking chairs that looked inviting despite the growing chill in the air. "Oh, Michael," Sarah whispered, her earlier anxieties momentarily forgotten. "It's absolutely gorgeous." They parked next to the cabin and sat for a moment, taking in the scene. The property was larger than Sarah had expected, with the main house nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering trees. She could see the beginning of what looked like hiking trails disappearing into the forest in several directions. A small outbuilding, perhaps an old workshop or storage shed, sat about 50 yards from the main house, partially hidden by overgrown rhododendron bushes. The silence was profound. After a lifetime of suburban living, where the constant hum of traffic and neighbors was the backdrop to daily life, the mountain quiet felt almost overwhelming. The only sounds were the gentle creak of tree branches in the wind and the distant murmur of the creek they'd crossed earlier. "Let's get our bags and get settled before it gets dark," Michael suggested, checking his watch. It was nearly 4:30, and the October sun was already hanging low in the sky. As they climbed the wide wooden steps to the front porch, Sarah noticed details that hadn't been visible in the online photos. The porch floorboards were worn, smooth by decades of weather and foot traffic, and several of the logs in the cabin's walls bore old scars, perhaps from storms or the settling that comes with age. Wind chimes hung from the porch rafters, their gentle tinkling the only sound, breaking the mountain silence. The front door was solid oak with an ornate brass knocker shaped like a pine cone. Beside it, a small wooden box contained the promised key, along with a handwritten welcome note from their host David Chen, who lived in Asheville and managed several properties in the area. "Welcome to Whispering Pines Retreat," the note read, in neat handwriting. "We hope you enjoy your stay in this piece of mountain history. The cabin has been lovingly restored to maintain its 1920s character, while providing modern amenities for your comfort. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you need anything during your visit. Cell service can be spotty, but the landline in the kitchen works reliably. Enjoy the peace and beauty of Cedar Hollow." Michael unlocked the door and stepped aside to let Sarah enter first. The interior took her breath away once again. The main room featured soaring cathedral ceilings with exposed wooden beams, and a massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. Original hardwood floors gleamed in the late afternoon light, streaming through tall windows. The furnishings were a perfect blend of antique charm and modern comfort: mission-style furniture, hand-woven rugs, and carefully chosen artwork that celebrated the natural beauty of the mountains. "This is incredible," Sarah said, running her hand along the smooth surface of a handcrafted dining table. I feel like we've stepped back in time. The kitchen had been thoughtfully updated with modern appliances, while maintaining the cabin's historical character. Copper pots hung from hooks above a vintage-style stove, and the countertops were butcher block that had been polished to a warm shine. French doors from the kitchen opened onto a side porch that offered a stunning view of the forest canopy. As they explored the upstairs, Sarah found herself increasingly impressed with the restoration. The master bedroom featured a king-size bed, covered with a beautiful quilt that looked handmade, and the bathroom had been updated with a clawfoot tub that invited long, relaxing soaks. A smaller bedroom had been converted into a cozy reading nook with built-in bookshelves and a window seat that overlooked the forest. "You know what?" Sarah said as they finished their initial tour. "I think Rebecca was right. This is exactly what we needed." They spent the next hour settling in, unpacking their clothes and groceries, and familiarizing themselves with the cabin's layout. Michael started a fire in the great room, while Sarah prepared a simple dinner from the supplies they'd brought. As evening approached, the temperature dropped noticeably, making the crackling fire and warm interior feel even more welcoming. It wasn't until they sat down to dinner that Sarah first noticed something that made her uneasy. She was setting their plates on the dining table when she glanced through the large front window and saw something that made her pause. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, barely visible, in the gathering dusk. "Michael," she called softly, "come look at this." He joined her at the window, but when they both peered into the growing darkness, there was nothing to see but trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. "What did you think you saw?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. I thought there was someone standing out there watching the house, but I'm sure it was just shadows playing tricks on my eyes." She leaned back against his familiar warmth, telling herself she was being silly. The changing light can make you see things that aren't there. They returned to their dinner, and Sarah tried to push the incident from her mind. The meal was peaceful, lit by candles Michael had found in a kitchen drawer and accompanied by the gentle crackling of the fire. They talked about their plans for the weekend, hiking some of the local trails, exploring the nearby town, and simply enjoying each other's company without the usual distractions of home. But as the evening wore on, Sarah found herself glancing frequently toward the windows. The darkness outside seemed especially deep, pressing against the glass like something alive. Several times she thought she heard sounds that didn't quite fit, a soft tapping that might have been branches against the cabin, or footsteps that could have been small animals moving through the underbrush. "You're awfully quiet tonight," Michael observed as they cleaned up after dinner. "Having second thoughts about our mountain adventure?" Sarah forced a smile. "Not at all. I think I'm just tired from the drive. And you know how I get in new places. It takes me a while to feel settled." It was true, Sarah had always been someone who needed time to adjust to new environments. Even hotel stays made her slightly anxious for the first night, as she oriented herself to unfamiliar sounds and spaces. But this felt different somehow, more intense than her usual travel jitters. They decided to turn in early, both exhausted from the drive and eager to wake up refreshed for their first full day in the mountains. As they prepared for bed, Sarah was grateful for the routine of familiar activities, brushing her teeth, changing into comfortable pajamas, and following the nighttime rituals they'd developed over 3 decades of marriage. The upstairs bedroom was cozy and inviting, and the handmade quilt felt soft and welcoming against her skin. Michael was asleep within minutes, his gentle snoring a comforting sound that usually helped Sarah drift off as well. But sleep eluded her that night. She lay awake listening to the mountain sounds, the wind through the pine trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional crack of settling wood in the old cabin. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness, and her mind kept returning to that brief glimpse of a figure at the tree line. Around midnight, she heard something that made her heart race. It sounded like footsteps on the front porch, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking back and forth across the wooden planks. She held her breath, straining to listen, but after a few moments, the sound stopped. Sarah debated whether to wake Michael, but she knew he'd want to investigate, and she wasn't sure she was ready to face whatever might be out there. Instead, she slipped quietly from bed and moved to the bedroom window that overlooked the front of the property. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the clearing around the cabin. She could see the rocking chairs on the porch, gently moving in the night breeze. But there was no sign of anyone or anything that might have caused the footstep sounds. As she stood at the window, scanning the moonlit landscape, she noticed something odd about one of the rocking chairs. It seemed to be moving with a different rhythm than the wind would cause. Not the random swaying she'd expect, but a steady, purposeful rocking, as if someone were sitting in it. Sarah's mouth went dry as she watched the chair continue its steady motion for several minutes before gradually slowing to match the gentle movement of its companion. She remained at the window for nearly an hour, but the mysterious rocking didn't resume. When she finally returned to bed, her mind was spinning with possible explanations. The chair could have been set in motion by a gust of wind and simply taken time to slow down. Mountain properties were often visited by wildlife, bears, deer, even curious raccoons that might have briefly explored the porch before moving on. But as she finally drifted towards sleep in the early morning hours, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something about their peaceful mountain retreat wasn't quite what it seemed. The last thought that crossed her mind before sleep claimed her was a memory of one of those online reviews she'd read. Beautiful place, but something felt off. We left a day early. Sarah awoke to the gentle sound of Michael moving around in the kitchen below, the familiar clink of coffee cups and the whistle of the kettle, creating a comforting morning symphony. Pale golden light filtered through the bedroom curtains, and she could hear birds chirping in the trees outside. Sounds that should have filled her with the peace and contentment she'd hoped for on this getaway. Instead, she felt heavy with exhaustion. The restless night had left her feeling more tired than when she'd gone to bed, and the memories of strange sounds and mysterious rocking chairs seemed almost dreamlike in the morning light. She tried to convince herself that her overactive imagination had simply gotten the better of her in an unfamiliar place. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Michael called as she made her way downstairs, still in her pajamas and robe. He'd already started a fire in the great room, and the coffee smelled wonderfully strong. "I thought you might sleep until noon after yesterday's drive." "I didn't sleep as well as I'd hoped," Sarah admitted, accepting the steaming mug he offered. "Hurricane, new place jitters, I suppose. How long have you been up?" "About an hour. I stepped out on the porch to watch the sunrise, and I have to say, this place is even more beautiful in the morning light. You can see for miles through those trees." He gestured toward the front windows, where morning sunlight was painting the forest in shades of gold and amber. Sarah joined him at the window, cradling her coffee cup and breathing in the rich mountain air that drifted through a partially open window. The view was indeed spectacular. She could see layers of mountains stretching toward the horizon, their peaks shrouded in wisps of morning mist. The trees around the cabin were a magnificent tapestry of autumn colors, brilliant reds and oranges mixed with the deep green of the pine trees. "It really is gorgeous," she agreed, and for a moment, her anxiety from the night before seemed silly and overblown. "What should we do first today?" They spent a leisurely morning exploring the immediate area around the cabin. Michael was eager to investigate the hiking trails that disappeared into the forest, while Sarah was content to sit on the front porch with her book, enjoying the crisp mountain air and the peaceful sounds of nature. The daylight hours passed pleasantly. They took a short hike on a well-marked trail that led to a small waterfall about half a mile from the cabin. The path was clearly maintained, with wooden bridges over creek crossings and occasional benches where they could rest and enjoy the scenery. Sarah found herself relaxing more completely than she had in months. "This is exactly what we needed," she told Michael as they sat beside the waterfall, listening to the soothing sound of water cascading over smooth rocks. "I'm sorry I was so nervous about coming here." "No need to apologize," he replied, squeezing her hand. "You know I understand your need to feel safe and secure, but sometimes stepping outside our comfort zone leads to the best experiences." They returned to the cabin in the late afternoon to find a pleasant surprise waiting for them. A small basket sat on the front porch filled with local apples, homemade jam, and a bottle of wine from a nearby vineyard. A note attached explained that it was a welcome gift from David, their host, who hoped they were enjoying their stay. How thoughtful, Sarah said, examining the beautifully packaged items. I should call and thank him. She tried the landline in the kitchen, but David's number went straight to voicemail. She left a message expressing their appreciation for the welcome basket and the beautiful property, then returned to help Michael prepare dinner. As evening approached, Sarah felt her anxiety returning. She couldn't explain why the onset of darkness seemed to bring with it a sense of unease, but she found herself growing increasingly tense as the sun sank lower in the sky. She busied herself with dinner preparations, trying to focus on the familiar rhythms of cooking and setting the table. You seem nervous again, Michael observed as they sat down to eat. Is everything all right? Sarah hesitated. She didn't want to ruin their weekend with what might be nothing more than her own overactive imagination, but she also knew that keeping her feelings to herself would only make them worse. I heard some strange sounds last night, she admitted. Footsteps on the porch and one of the rocking chairs seemed to be moving on its own. I know it sounds silly, but it made me feel uneasy. Michael reached across the table and took her hand. It doesn't sound silly at all. Old houses make lots of noises, especially when you're not used to them, and mountain properties often get visitors, deer, raccoons, sometimes even bears. The chair could have been disturbed by any number of things. His rational explanation helped calm her nerves, and they finished dinner in comfortable conversation about their plans for the next day. They'd decided to drive into the nearby town of Cedar Hollow to explore the local shops and maybe find a nice restaurant for lunch. But as they cleaned up after dinner, Sarah noticed something that made her heart race. On the kitchen counter, next to where they'd left the welcome basket, sat a small wooden box that she was certain hadn't been there earlier. Michael, she called, her voice tight with concern. Did you bring this inside? He looked up from loading the dishwasher and frowned. Bring what inside? This box. It wasn't here when we were preparing dinner. Michael wiped his hands on a dish towel and came to examine the object. It was about the size of a jewelry box, made from dark wood that looked very old. The craftsmanship was beautiful, with intricate carvings around the edges, but something about it felt unsettling. Maybe it was part of the welcome basket and we just didn't notice it before, Michael suggested, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. Sarah shook her head. I unpacked everything from that basket very carefully. This wasn't in there. They stood in silence for a moment, both staring at the mysterious box. Finally, Michael reached for it, but Sarah caught his hand. Wait, she said, should we? I mean, if it wasn't here before, how did it get here? There has to be a logical explanation, Michael said, though his confidence seemed somewhat forced. Maybe David stopped by while we were out hiking and left it as another surprise, or maybe housekeeping missed it when they were preparing the cabin for our arrival. Despite her reservations, curiosity eventually won out. Michael carefully lifted the lid of the wooden box, and they both gasped at what they found inside. Nestled in faded silk lining was a piece of fabric that looked very old, perhaps part of a dress or curtain from decades past. But what made Sarah's stomach lurch was that the fabric was soaked with some kind of dark, viscous substance that had an unpleasant metallic smell. Oh my God, Sarah whispered, stepping back from the counter. What is that? Michael quickly closed the box, his face pale. I don't know, but we should call David right away. This definitely wasn't supposed to be here. They tried calling their host multiple times, but each attempt went directly to voicemail. Sarah's anxiety was now in full bloom, and she found herself pacing the kitchen while Michael tried to come up with rational explanations. Maybe it's some kind of historical artifact, he suggested. This cabin is nearly 100 years old. Perhaps it belonged to the original owners and was accidentally left behind. But even as he spoke, they both knew that explanation didn't account for how the box had appeared on their kitchen counter during the few hours they'd been away from the cabin. As they debated what to do, Sarah made another disturbing discovery. Tucked inside the lid of the box was what appeared to be an old photograph, black and white and severely damaged by age and moisture. The image was barely visible, but it seemed to show two figures walking away from the camera down what looked like a forest path. This gives me chills, Sarah said, holding the photograph up to the light. Look at this. The people in the photo are walking into the woods, just like the trails around here. Michael studied the image, squinting at the faded details. The quality is so poor it's hard to make out anything specific. And photographs this old aren't uncommon in historic properties. The previous owners might have left all sorts of memorabilia behind. But Sarah noticed something that made her even more uncomfortable. Despite the photograph's aged appearance, the paper itself felt wrong somehow, too smooth and modern for something that looked decades old. As the evening wore on, they tried to distract themselves with books and quiet conversation by the fire. But the mysterious box sat on the kitchen counter like an unwelcome presence impossible to ignore. Sarah found herself glancing toward the kitchen every few minutes, as if expecting the box to have moved or disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared. Around 10 o'clock, they decided to turn in early again, both exhausted by the emotional toll of the day's discovery. Sarah packed the wooden box away in a kitchen drawer, not wanting to see it, but afraid to throw it away in case it really was some kind of historical artifact that belonged with the property. As they prepared for bed, Michael tried to reassure her. "Tomorrow we'll drive into town and see if we can find David or someone else who knows about the history of this place. I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything." Sarah wanted to believe him, but as she lay in bed, listening to the night sounds of the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful mountain retreat was harboring secrets that went far beyond an old wooden box and some mysterious fabric. The wind had picked up during the evening, and the cabin creaked and groaned around them as the old timbers responded to the changing temperature. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness, and Sarah found herself straining to distinguish between normal house noises and anything that might be out of place. Around midnight, she heard it again, the sound of footsteps on the front porch. This time she was certain she wasn't imagining it. The steady rhythm of someone walking back and forth across the wooden planks was unmistakable. Sarah nudged Michael awake, her heart pounding in her chest. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Michael listened for a moment, his expression growing serious as the footstep sounds continued. "Stay here," he said, reaching for his robe. "I'm going to take a look." "No," Sarah grabbed his arm. "Don't go out there. What if someone's trying to break in?" "If someone's on our porch, I need to know who it is and what they want," Michael replied, with the protective instinct that had always made Sarah feel safe. "Maybe it's David coming to check on us, or a neighbor who needs help." Against Sarah's protests, Michael made his way downstairs while she remained at the bedroom window, watching for any sign of movement in the moonlit yard. She could hear him moving through the cabin below, probably looking out windows to get a view of the porch. After several minutes that felt like hours, Michael returned to the bedroom, his expression troubled. "I couldn't see anyone," he reported. But the rocking chairs were both moving, like someone had just gotten up from sitting in them. "And I found something else that's strange." He held up a piece of paper that looked like it had been slipped under the front door. Written on it in shaky handwriting were the words, "They're not alone in the woods." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as she read the ominous message. Who would leave something like this? And what does it mean? "I don't know," Michael admitted, sinking onto the edge of the bed. "But I think we need to seriously consider leaving first thing in the morning." For the first time since they'd arrived, Sarah felt a surge of relief. The thought of packing up and heading home to their safe, familiar house filled her with gratitude. Whatever was happening at Whispering Pines Retreat, she no longer wanted to be part of it. They spent the rest of the night taking turns keeping watch, neither of them able to sleep, with the mysterious note serving as a constant reminder that their mountain getaway had taken a decidedly dark turn. As dawn approached, they began quietly packing their belongings, eager to put the strange events behind them. But when Michael went outside to load their car, he discovered something that made their decision to leave even more urgent. Scratched into the dirt beside their vehicle were symbols that neither of them recognized, strange markings that looked almost like a primitive form of writing. "We're leaving right now," Michael announced when he came back inside. "No discussion, no delays. Something is very wrong here." As they carried their bags to the car, Sarah took one last look at the beautiful cabin that had promised such a peaceful retreat. In the early morning light, it still looked charming and welcoming, giving no hint of the unsettling experiences they'd endured. But as they drove away down the gravel driveway, Sarah noticed something in the rearview mirror that made her blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the tree line, barely visible among the shadows, was a figure watching their departure. Just as she'd glimpsed on their first evening, someone or something had been observing them. She didn't mention it to Michael, who was focused on navigating the winding mountain roads and putting distance between them and Whispering Pines Retreat. But as the miles passed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they'd encountered in those beautiful, terrible woods wasn't quite finished with them yet. 3 days after their hasty departure from Whispering Pines Retreat, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. She moved through their comfortable suburban home like a ghost, starting projects she couldn't finish, picking up books she couldn't read, and jumping at every unexpected sound. Michael had tried calling David Chen multiple times since their return, but their host's phone continued to go straight to voicemail. They'd also attempted to report their concerns to local authorities, but the weekend desk sergeant at the Cedar Hollow Sheriff's Department had seemed more amused than concerned by their account of mysterious boxes and strange footsteps. Probably just raccoons, the officer had said with barely concealed laughter in his voice. You city folk sometimes get spooked by normal mountain sounds. If there was any real trouble up there, we'd have heard about it by now. The dismissive response had left both Sarah and Michael feeling frustrated and somehow foolish, as if their very real fear had been reduced to nothing more than urban paranoia. But Sarah knew what she'd experienced, and she couldn't simply dismiss the memory of that figure watching from the trees as they drove away. On Wednesday evening, as they sat in their living room trying to pretend everything was normal, their daughter Rebecca called with news that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "Mom, the strangest thing happened," Rebecca said, her voice carrying an unusual note of concern. "I tried to contact the owners of that Airbnb to write a follow-up piece for my blog, and the listing has completely disappeared. Not just unavailable, completely gone, like it never existed." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "What do you mean gone?" "I mean, when I search for properties in Cedar Hollow, nothing comes up at all. And when I try to access the original listing through my saved links, I get error messages saying the page doesn't exist. It's like Whispering Pines Retreat has been erased from the internet." Michael took the phone from Sarah's trembling hands. "Rebecca, this is Dad. Are you absolutely certain you're looking in the right place?" "I'm positive. I spent hours yesterday trying different search terms and checking multiple booking platforms. There's no trace of the property anywhere. And here's the really weird part. When I called the booking platform's customer service to ask about it, they said they have no record of any property by that name and no record of your reservation." The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. How could a place where they'd stayed just days ago simply vanish from all records? How could their reservation, which they'd booked and paid for, leave no trace in any system? "Have you been able to reach David?" Rebecca asked. "No," Michael replied, his voice tight with worry. "We've been trying for days. All our calls go straight to voicemail, and he hasn't returned any of our messages." After they hung up, Sarah and Michael sat in stunned silence. The rational explanations they'd been clinging to, that they'd simply had a spooky experience in an old house, that their imaginations had gotten the better of them, were crumbling in the face of this new information. "There has to be a logical reason," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe David pulled the listing because of property issues. Maybe there were problems with the booking platform." But even as he spoke, they both knew these explanations felt inadequate. The complete erasure of all records suggested something far more disturbing than simple technical difficulties. That night, Sarah's sleep was plagued by vivid dreams of the mountain cabin. In her dreams, she walked through the beautifully appointed rooms while shadows moved just beyond her peripheral vision. She kept finding the wooden box in different locations throughout the house, and each time she opened it, the dark-stained fabric inside seemed to pulse with a life of its own. She woke several times in a cold sweat, her heart racing from nightmares that felt more like memories than dreams. Each time, Michael held her close and murmured reassurances, but she could feel the tension in his body and knew he was struggling with his own dark thoughts about their mountain experience. On Friday morning, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. "I want to go back," she announced over breakfast. Michael nearly choked on his coffee. "What, Sarah? After everything we experienced, after what Rebecca discovered, you want to return to that place? I want answers, Sarah said with a determination that felt foreign but necessary. I can't live like this, jumping at shadows and second-guessing my own memories. If we go back during the day, in bright sunlight, maybe we can figure out what really happened. Michael studied her face for a long moment. After 32 years of marriage, he knew when Sarah had made up her mind about something. If we do this, we're not staying overnight. We drive up, look around in daylight, and come straight home. Agreed, Sarah said, though even as she spoke, she wondered if whatever they'd encountered in those woods would be satisfied with such a brief visit. The drive back to the mountains felt like traveling through a landscape of memory and dread. Every familiar landmark, the gas station where they'd stopped for snacks, the scenic overlook where they'd paused to admire the view, the narrow bridge over the rushing creek, seemed charged with ominous significance. When they reached the gravel driveway marked by the hand-carved wooden sign, Sarah felt her courage wavering. The familiar sight of the beautiful log cabin should have been reassuring, but instead, it filled her with a sense of impending discovery that she wasn't sure she was ready to face. It looks exactly the same, Michael observed as they parked, in the same spot they'd used before. Whatever's going on here, it hasn't affected the physical appearance of the place. They approached the front porch cautiously, as if the wooden steps might give way beneath their feet. Sarah noticed that the rocking chairs were perfectly still in the windless air, and she found herself staring at them, waiting for some sign of the mysterious movement they'd witnessed before. The key box is still here, Michael noted, examining the small wooden container beside the front door. But it's empty. Sarah tried the door handle and was surprised to find it unlocked. The door swung open easily, revealing the familiar interior that had once seemed so welcoming and now felt heavy with unspoken secrets. "Hello?" Michael called, as they stepped inside. "David, is anyone here?" Their voices echoed in the silent cabin, unanswered. The main room looked exactly as they'd left it, with cold ashes in the fireplace and morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows. But something felt different, a quality of stillness that went beyond normal quiet. Sarah made her way to the kitchen, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't explain. The drawer where she'd hidden the wooden box was slightly ajar, and when she pulled it open, her heart sank. The box was gone. "Michael," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. "The box is missing." He joined her in the kitchen, and together they searched through all the drawers and cabinets. There was no sign of the mysterious wooden container or its disturbing contents. "Maybe David came and collected it," Michael suggested. "Maybe it really was some kind of historical artifact that belonged with the property." But Sarah shook her head. "If David had been here, wouldn't he have returned our calls? Wouldn't he have left a note or some explanation?" As they continued their search of the cabin, they discovered other subtle changes. The welcome basket was gone from the kitchen counter. The bottle of wine David had left as a gift was missing from where they'd placed it on the dining room table. Most unsettling of all, the guest book that had been prominently displayed on the coffee table, where previous visitors had left glowing reviews of their stays, had vanished without a trace. "It's like someone is erasing all evidence that guests have ever stayed here," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a fear she could no longer deny. They moved upstairs to check the bedrooms, and Sarah felt her breath catch as they entered the master suite. The bed was neatly made with fresh linens, but the beautiful handmade quilt that had covered it during their stay was nowhere to be seen. In its place was a plain white bedspread that looked institutional and unwelcoming. But the most disturbing discovery came when Michael examined the window that Sarah had stood at during her sleepless nights, carved into the wooden window frame, so faintly that they might have missed it. In artificial light were symbols that matched the strange markings they'd found scratched in the dirt beside their car. "Sarah," Michael's voice was tight with emotion. "Look at this." She joined him at the window, and her blood ran cold as she traced the carved symbols with her finger. The markings were old, deeply etched into the wood and darkened with age, suggesting they'd been there far longer than their recent visit. "These symbols, they're the same ones we saw in the dirt by our car," she whispered, "but these look like they've been here for years." The implication was terrifying. Whatever they'd encountered during their stay wasn't a random occurrence or a recent development. The strange symbols suggested a pattern of events that had been repeating for who knows how long. As they stood at the window, Sarah found herself looking out at the forest that surrounded the cabin. In daylight, the trees looked peaceful and inviting, with autumn sunlight filtering through the colorful leaves. But her mind kept returning to that glimpse of a figure watching from the shadows, and she wondered how many other visitors to Whispering Pines Retreat had seen the same mysterious presence. "We need to search the rest of the property," Michael said with grim determination. "If there are answers to be found, they might be in that outbuilding we saw, or somewhere else on the grounds." The small structure they'd noticed during their first day sat about 50 yards from the main house, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. As they approached it, Sarah noticed that what she'd initially thought was a workshop or storage shed was actually more substantial than it had appeared from a distance. The building was constructed from the same aged logs as the main cabin, but it looked older somehow, more weathered by time and neglect. Heavy wooden doors secured with a modern padlock blocked their access, but Michael found a window on the side of the building that allowed them to peer inside. What they saw through the dusty glass made Sarah's stomach lurch with a combination of fear and recognition. The interior of the building was filled with wooden boxes, dozens of them all identical to the one that had mysteriously appeared in their kitchen. They were stacked on shelves and tables, creating a storage space that looked like a macabre museum of the strange artifacts. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed. "There are so many of them." Michael pressed his face closer to the window, trying to make out more details in the dim interior. "I can see something else," he said. "There are photographs pinned to the walls, lots of them." Sarah forced herself to look more closely, and her worst fears were confirmed. The walls of the building were covered with black and white photographs, similar to the one they'd found in their wooden box. But these images were clearer, and the details they revealed made Sarah's knees weak with terror. Each photograph showed two figures walking away from the camera down forest paths. The clothing and hairstyles varied, suggesting the photos had been taken over many years, possibly decades. But the pose was always the same. Two people walking hand in hand into the woods, captured from behind at the moment they disappeared into the trees. "We need to leave," Sarah said, backing away from the window. "Right now. We need to call the police, the FBI, someone who can investigate this properly." But as they turned to head back to their car, they discovered something that made Sarah's heart stop. Carved into a large pine tree near the storage building were fresh symbols, the same mysterious markings they'd seen at the cabin, but these looked like they'd been cut into the bark very recently. Below the symbols, someone had scratched a single word in English: "missing." The implications crashed over Sarah like a cold wave. How many couples had come to Whispering Pines Retreat over the years? How many had encountered the same strange phenomena they'd experienced? And most terrifying of all, how many had not been fortunate enough to leave when they did? As they hurried back to their car, Sarah felt the weight of unseen eyes watching their every move. The beautiful mountain landscape that had once seemed so peaceful now felt like a carefully constructed trap, designed to lure unsuspecting visitors into something far more sinister than a simple vacation rental. "Drive," she urged Michael, as soon as they were both in the car. "Drive as fast as you can." But even as they sped away down the mountain roads, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their connection to Whispering Pines Retreat was far from over. The symbols, the photographs, the missing records, everything pointed to a pattern that had been repeating for years, possibly decades. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a terrifying thought was taking root. What if their escape had been allowed to happen? What if they were meant to return home with questions they couldn't answer and memories they couldn't forget? What if their real role in this mountain mystery was just beginning? The sleepless nights that followed their second visit to Whispering Pines Retreat took a devastating toll on both Sarah and Michael. What had begun as vacation jitters had evolved into something much darker, a persistent anxiety that colored every aspect of their daily lives. Sarah found herself checking and rechecking locks on doors and windows, startling at unexpected phone calls, and experiencing moments of panic when Michael was out of her sight for more than a few minutes. Michael had thrown himself into research with an intensity that worried Sarah almost as much as their mountain experience itself. He spent hours online, searching for any information about missing persons in the Cedar Hollow area, historical records of the property, and anything that might explain the symbols they'd discovered carved into wood and scratched into earth. "I found something," he announced on a grey Tuesday morning, nearly 2 weeks after their return. His voice carried a mixture of excitement and dread that made Sarah's stomach clench with apprehension. She joined him at their home office computer, where he'd pulled up a digitized newspaper archive from the Asheville Citizen-Times. The headline from October 15, 1987, made her blood run cold. "Mountain couple vanishes during weekend getaway." "Listen to this," Michael said, his voice shaking slightly as he read. "Local couple Janet and Robert Morrison, both in their 60s, disappeared while staying at a remote mountain property in Cedar Hollow. The couple had been looking forward to a peaceful weekend retreat to celebrate their 35th wedding anniversary. Their car was found at the property with all their belongings still inside, but no trace of the couple was ever discovered despite extensive searches by law enforcement and volunteer teams." Sarah sank into the chair beside him, her mind reeling with the implications. "That's almost exactly what happened to us," she whispered, "except we left when we did." Michael scrolled through more archived articles, and their worst fears were confirmed. Every few years, dating back to the early 1980s, there were reports of couples who had vanished while staying at various mountain properties in the Cedar Hollow area. The details varied, but the pattern was unmistakable. Couples in their later years seeking peaceful getaways disappearing without explanation during weekend visits to remote mountain rentals. "Look at this one from 1993, Michael said, pointing to another headline. "And this one from 1999 and 2005. Sarah, this has been happening for decades." The most chilling discovery came when Michael found a forum thread from 2018 titled "Strange Experiences at Mountain Rentals." The discussion contained dozens of posts from people who had encountered unexplained phenomena during stays at various properties throughout the region. Many described experiences identical to their own: mysterious objects appearing in houses, strange symbols, feelings of being watched, and an overwhelming urge to flee. But buried deep in the thread was a post that made Sarah's hands tremble as she read it. A woman named Linda Chen had written about her father David, who managed several mountain rental properties and had become increasingly troubled by reports from guests about strange occurrences. "My dad started having nightmares about the properties he manages," Linda had written. "He kept talking about couples who checked in but never checked out, and how the authorities always seemed to lose interest in investigating the disappearances. He was convinced something terrible was happening in those mountains, but nobody would listen to him. Last month he disappeared too." The post was dated 6 months earlier. Sarah felt the world spinning around her as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. David Chen, their host who had never returned their calls, had been trying to expose whatever was happening in Cedar Hollow, and now he was missing too. "We have to go to the authorities," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The FBI, the state police, someone who can investigate this properly." But Michael's expression was grim as he pulled up another browser window. "I already tried. I spent yesterday making calls to every law enforcement agency I could think of. They all gave me the same response. Without concrete evidence of a crime, there's nothing they can do. Missing persons cases in remote areas are often explained by people choosing to start new lives elsewhere, and the strange experiences we described are considered unreliable witness accounts." The feeling of helplessness that washed over Sarah was almost overwhelming. How could a pattern of disappearances spanning decades go uninvestigated? How could the systematic vanishing of couples be dismissed as coincidence? "There's something else," Michael said, his voice heavy with dread. "I found David Chen's personal social media accounts. Look at his last post." The Facebook post was dated 3 days before their stay at Whispering Pines Retreat. David had written, "If anything happens to me, look into the symbol carved on the old oak behind the Peterson cabin. It's the key to everything. The guests who find the boxes are never meant to leave." Sarah felt her vision blur as the implications of David's message sank in. They had found the box. They had been marked somehow by their discovery. And according to David's warning, they were never meant to leave the mountain alive. "But we did leave," she said desperately. "We got away." Michael's silence spoke volumes. They both knew that their escape felt too easy, too convenient. If whatever force was at work in those mountains had been claiming couples for decades, why had they been allowed to return home? The answer came that evening in a way that shattered their last hope of putting the experience behind them. Sarah was preparing dinner when she noticed something that made her drop the plates she was carrying, sending them crashing to the kitchen floor. Sitting on their kitchen counter, in the exact same position where it had appeared at the mountain cabin, was the wooden box. "Michael!" she screamed, her voice echoing through their suburban home. "Michael, come here right now." He rushed into the kitchen and stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the impossible sight. The same box, with its intricate carvings and age-darkened wood, sat before them like an accusation. "That's impossible," he breathed. "It can't be the same box. We left it at the cabin. We saw it was missing when we went back." But when Sarah forced herself to approach the counter and examine the object more closely, she knew with absolute certainty that it was the same box they'd found in the mountain cabin. Every detail of the carving matched her memory perfectly, down to a small chip in the wood near the latch. With trembling hands, she opened the lid, and her worst fears were confirmed. Inside, nestled in the same faded silk lining, was the piece of stained fabric. But now there was something else. A new photograph, this one crisp and clear despite being printed in black and white. The image showed two figures walking away from the camera down a suburban sidewalk. The setting was instantly recognizable. It was their own neighborhood, their own street. And though the figures in the photograph were seen from behind, Sarah knew with bone-deep certainty that she was looking at Michael and herself. "When was this taken?" Michael asked, his voice hollow with fear. Sarah studied the image more closely and noticed details that made her stomach churn. She and Michael were wearing the exact clothes they'd worn during their second visit to the mountain cabin. The photograph showed them walking away from their own front door, captured at the moment they'd left for their return trip to Whispering Pines Retreat. Someone or something had been watching them from the very beginning. Their home, their neighborhood, their entire life had been under surveillance by forces they couldn't understand or escape. As they stared at the photograph in horrified silence, Sarah noticed writing on the back of the image. In the same shaky handwriting they'd seen on the note slipped under the cabin door, someone had written, "The circle must be completed." The meaning was terrifyingly clear. Whatever had begun at Whispering Pines Retreat wasn't finished with them. They had been marked, chosen, and their temporary escape had been nothing more than a reprieve. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, her practical nature asserting itself even in the face of incomprehensible terror. "If they know where we live, if they can enter our home, we're not safe anywhere." But even as she spoke, she realized the futility of their situation. If the force behind the mountain disappearances could reach them in their own home, could plant evidence and take photographs without their knowledge, where could they possibly go to escape? Michael seemed to read her thoughts. "Maybe that's the point," he said quietly. "Maybe we're not supposed to run. Maybe we're supposed to go back and finish whatever we started." The suggestion filled Sarah with horror, but she also recognized a terrible logic in it. Every couple who had disappeared in those mountains had tried to leave, tried to escape whatever they'd encountered, but their own experience suggested that leaving wasn't really an option. It was just a temporary delay. "There has to be another way," she insisted. "There has to be something we can do to break this pattern." They spent the rest of the evening researching everything they could find about the symbols they'd seen, the history of the Cedar Hollow area, and any folklore or legends that might explain what they were facing. Most of their searches led to dead ends, but Michael finally found a reference in an obscure academic paper about Appalachian folk traditions. "Listen to this," he said, reading from the screen. "There are old stories among mountain communities about places where time doesn't work the same way, where the boundary between past and present becomes thin. These locations are marked by symbols that serve as warnings to travelers, but also as invitations for those who are meant to join the timeless community that exists beyond normal reality. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. A timeless community. What does that mean? Michael continued reading. According to the folklore, certain individuals are chosen to become part of this eternal gathering. They're drawn to the marked locations through a series of signs and experiences, and once they join the community, they exist outside of normal time, helping to guide other chosen individuals to the same fate. The implications were staggering. If the folklore was accurate, then every couple who had disappeared in those mountains might still be there in some form, existing in a state beyond normal understanding, working to draw new victims into their timeless community. The photographs, Sarah whispered, understanding flooding through her. All those photographs on the walls of the storage building, they weren't just records of disappearances. They were invitations, showing other couples the path they were meant to follow. As if summoned by her words, they heard a sound. That made their blood freeze. Footsteps on their front porch, slow and deliberate, exactly like the sounds they'd heard at the mountain cabin. Michael moved to the front window and carefully peered through the curtains. What he saw there made him stagger backward, his face pale with terror. "There are people on our porch," he whispered. "Multiple couples, all standing perfectly still, all facing our front door." Sarah joined him at the window, and her knees nearly gave out at the sight. 6 couples stood on their porch and front yard, all motionless, all staring at their house with expressions of patient expectation. The couples appeared to be from different time periods. Their clothing and hairstyles spanned decades, but they all shared the same unnaturally pale complexion and the same vacant, waiting expression. "They're the missing couples," Sarah realized with mounting horror. "The ones who disappeared over the years. They're here to bring us back." As if responding to her words, one of the figures, a woman in clothing that looked like it was from the 1980s, began walking toward their front door. Her movement was unnaturally smooth, like she was gliding rather than walking, and her eyes never left the window where Sarah and Michael stood. The woman raised her hand and knocked on the door 3 times. The sound echoed through their house like gunshots. "We have to go," Michael said, grabbing Sarah's hand. "Back door, right? Now!" They ran through their house toward the kitchen, but as they reached the back door, Sarah saw more figures standing in their backyard. The timeless community had surrounded their home, cutting off every escape route. "The basement," Sarah gasped. "We can hide in the basement." But as they reached the top of the basement stairs, they heard the sound that shattered their last hope. The front door was opening, its lock apparently no barrier to their supernatural visitors. Footsteps began, moving through their house, multiple sets, walking with that same unnaturally smooth gait they'd witnessed through the window. The sounds moved systematically from room to room, as if the intruders were conducting a methodical search. Sarah and Michael descended into their basement, but they both knew it was only a temporary refuge. The forces that had found them in their own home would not be stopped by a closed door or a hiding place. As they huddled together in the dark basement, listening to the footsteps moving through the house above them, Sarah finally understood the true horror of their situation. The mountain retreat, the mysterious box, the strange symbols. It had all been part of an elaborate recruitment process. They had been chosen to join the timeless community, and their resistance had only delayed the inevitable. "I love you," she whispered to Michael, tears streaming down her face. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that these 32 years with you have been the most beautiful gift of my life." "I love you too," he replied, holding her close as the footsteps above them grew closer. "And maybe if we're together, whatever comes next won't be so terrible." The basement door opened, and pale light spilled down the stairs. The footsteps began their descent, slow and patient, like time itself was being stretched to accommodate this final moment. Sarah closed her eyes and thought about their children, their grandchildren, the life they were leaving behind. But she also thought about David Chen, who had tried to warn them, and all the other couples who had faced this same moment over the decades. As the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and began approaching their hiding place, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. She and Michael had found each other across all the years and challenges of their marriage. If they were destined to join some eternal community beyond normal reality, At least they would face that destiny together. The last thing Sarah saw before the pale light consumed everything was Michael's face, full of love and acceptance, ready to walk with her into whatever timeless existence awaited them in the mountains they had tried so hard to escape. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the bonds that hold us together, even in the face of the unknown, please let us know by subscribing to our channel. Every story we share comes from the deepest places of human experience: love, loss, fear, and the connections that transcend even death itself. Hit that like button if Sarah and Michael's journey touched your heart, and leave a comment sharing your own thoughts about love that endures beyond understanding. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these powerful, true stories to light, honoring the couples whose mysteries remain unsolved and whose love stories echo through time. Thank you for walking with us through the shadows and into the light of human connection.